Picture this. You're a 10-year-old girl playing with your dolls in the courtyard of your family's home in ancient Rome. The morning sun slips through the tall columns as your mother hums softly while weaving nearby. Your father talks about business with visiting guests. It feels like an ordinary day in 57 BC, until the blast of ceremonial horns spreads through your neighborhood. The Pontifex Maximus has arrived to make his choice. You peek out from behind your mother's robes as the highest priest in Rome studies the gathered children. His sharp eyes scan each face with cold focus. When his gaze locks on you, time seems to freeze. He lifts his staff and speaks the words that will shatter your childhood forever. This one serves Vesta. Your mother drops to her knees, crying. Your father stands frozen, knowing that refusal means death for the whole family. You can't understand why everyone is weeping. You've just been picked for the greatest honor a Roman girl can receive. What you don't yet realize is that you've been sentenced to 30 years of sacred fear, followed by punishments so cruel that death would feel like mercy. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of pain and survival, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, consider hitting the like button and subscribing for more videos like this. And please share in the comments where you're watching from. I think it's amazing that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different corners of the world, linked across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Today we'll uncover the 3 most terrifying punishments that awaited Rome's Vestal Virgins. What you're about to hear isn't taught in any classroom because the truth was too dark for polished history books. These weren't just holy rituals gone wrong. They were methods of torture designed to control women through fear, disguised as divine justice. The choosing of a Vestal Virgin wasn't an honor. It was a kidnapping blessed by the gods and enforced by the state. The rules for selection were strict and chilling. The girl had to be between 6 and 10 years old, with both parents alive, born of Roman citizens, and free from any physical flaw. She had to be the child of a proper marriage, symbolically perfect in every way. But here's what most don't realize about this process. Families often hid their daughters when the Pontifex Maximus came looking. They sent girls away to far relatives, faked sudden sickness, or even used makeup to mark their faces, so they looked unfit. The choosing wasn't celebrated. It was fear. When a girl was picked, the change began right away. She was taken from her family that very day, never to return home. Her birth name was erased and replaced with a title marking her as property of the goddess Vestal. She couldn't inherit from her family, couldn't own land in her own name, and couldn't even send letters without being watched. The House of Vestals, where she would live for 3 decades, was described by ancient writers as the most beautiful prison ever made. Standing in the Roman Forum beside the Temple of Vesta, it held marble columns, decorated gardens, and rich furnishings. But luxury couldn't hide the truth. She was now a prisoner, watched at all times by older Vestals and priests. Her training began with learning the 3 sacred laws that would rule every moment of her life. First, eternal virginity for 30 years, with no chance of marriage or physical closeness. Second, absolute obedience to the Pontifex Maximus and senior religious authorities. Third, constant guardianship of the sacred flame that supposedly kept Rome itself alive. These weren't suggestions or guidelines. They were laws backed by punishments that made Roman crucifixions look humane. The young girl learned that her body no longer belonged to her. It belonged to Rome, and Rome had very specific ideas about what happened to women who failed in their duties. The Vestal was told that she was sacred, chosen by the gods, blessed above all other women in the empire. What they didn't tell her was that this sacred status made her punishments even more brutal. Because she was holy, she couldn't be executed like a common criminal. Instead, Rome had developed specialized torture methods that preserved her sanctity while destroying her humanity. Ancient sources describe new Vestals weeping for months after their selection, begging to return home, refusing to eat until forced. Senior Vestals would tell them that resistance was useless, that the goddess had chosen them, and that their suffering was part of their sacred duty. But the real message was simpler and more terrifying. You belong to us now forever. The psychological conditioning was systematic and complete. The girl learned that her worth as a person depended entirely on her performance as a Vestal. Any mistake, any moment of doubt, any sign of human weakness could trigger punishment that would make her long for death. But death wasn't allowed. She was too sacred to kill and too valuable to release. This sacred status became the foundation for punishments so creative in their cruelty that they've been studied by modern psychologists as examples of institutionalized psychological warfare. Rome had perfected the art of destroying a person's spirit while keeping their body alive to continue suffering. If you thought being selected as a Vestal Virgin was the worst part of the story, you haven't heard about what happened when they made their first mistake. The sacred flame in the Temple of Vesta was supposed to burn eternally, representing Rome's divine protection and eternal existence. If that flame ever went out, it wasn't just considered a religious failure. It was treated as an act of treason against the Roman state. When the flame died, the investigation began immediately. The Pontifex Maximus would interrogate each Vestal individually, searching for signs of negligence, distraction, or moral corruption that might have caused the catastrophe. The questioning could last for days, with the suspect locked in a windowless chamber beneath the temple, deprived of food and sleep until she confessed to some failing. But confession was only the beginning. The punishment was called the verberatio, and it took place in absolute darkness in the depths of the temple complex. The condemned Vestal would be stripped naked and bound to a wooden frame built specifically for this purpose. The Pontifex Maximus himself would deliver the beating, using consecrated rods blessed in Vesta's name. The beating wasn't random violence. It was a carefully orchestrated ritual designed to cause maximum pain while preserving the Vestal's sacred status. She could not be allowed to scream because her voice was considered holy. A leather gag was forced into her mouth, muffling any sound of agony. She could not be allowed to bleed openly because her blood was consecrated. The rods were designed to cause deep bruising and organ damage without breaking the skin. Ancient medical texts describe Vestals who died days later from internal injuries suffered during the verberatio. But the official cause of death was always recorded as sudden illness or divine displeasure, never punishment-related wounds. The beatings were carried out in such secrecy that most Romans never knew they even happened. The psychological warfare was just as brutal as the physical torture. The Vestal never knew when the next inspection of the flame would occur. She lived in constant fear that a draft might blow it out or that her attention might slip for only a moment. This constant terror created what modern psychologists would call severe anxiety disorders, showing up as physical symptoms across her body. Historical accounts describe Vestals who developed tremors, lost their hair from stress, and aged decades within only months after their first verberatio. The trauma wasn't only physical. It was a systematic destruction of their sense of safety and self-worth, breaking them down into obedience for decades of service. But the most insidious part of this punishment was its randomness. The sacred flame could die from natural causes completely outside of any Vestal's control. A sudden wind, a flaw in the temple's structure, or even sabotage by enemies could extinguish it. Yet responsibility always fell on the Vestals, and punishment was always inevitable. Some historical accounts suggest that the flame was deliberately extinguished by authorities who wanted to punish particular Vestals for political reasons, or personal grudges. The religious excuse gave them perfect cover for what was essentially state-sanctioned torture of defenseless women. The recovery process was deliberately prolonged to maximize psychological impact. The injured Vestal would be treated by temple physicians who had been ordered to provide only minimal care, ensuring that her healing was slow and painful. She would be reminded daily that her suffering was deserved, that she had failed in her sacred duty, and that only flawless service in the future might prevent more punishment. This created a cycle of trauma and obedience that could last for decades. Vestals who survived verberatio became completely subservient, terrified of showing any hint of independence or individuality that might trigger another round of punishment. They were transformed from human beings into hollow shells, performing their duties with mechanical precision while their spirits slowly withered inside. If you think ritualized beatings were Rome's most twisted form of cruelty, you haven't yet heard about their solution for Vestals accused of the ultimate crime. The charge was called incestum, meaning pollution or defilement, and it referred to any suspected violation of a Vestal's vow of chastity. The punishment for incestum was not execution. It was something far worse. The case of Uppia and Floronia in provides the most detailed account of this horror. According to the historian Livy, both women were accused of breaking their vows of chastity based on nothing more than gossip and political rivalry. Their trial, if it can even be called that, was conducted in total secrecy by the College of Pontiffs. No defense was allowed. No evidence was required beyond accusations from anonymous voices. When the verdict was delivered, the condemned Vestal was told she would be returned to the earth from which all life springs. This poetic phrase disguised a punishment so horrific it defied human comprehension. The ritual began at dawn with a solemn procession through the Roman Forum. The condemned Vestal was dressed in a white bridal gown, her hair arranged like that of a new bride, flowers woven into her veil. To bystanders, unaware of the truth, she might have looked like she was going to her wedding. In a sense, she was. She was being married to death. The procession moved slowly through the streets of Rome, giving the people a chance to witness what happened to women who defied sacred law. But the Vestal wasn't allowed to speak, to cry, or even to show emotion. Her mouth was sealed with wax, to prevent any final words that might stir sympathy among the crowd. The destination was the Campus Sceleratus, the field of the wicked, just outside the city walls. There, workers had spent days preparing her final resting place. A chamber had been carved into the earth, reached by a narrow staircase that would be sealed forever once she entered. Inside the underground chamber, Rome displayed its twisted sense of mercy. A bed was laid out along with a small lamp, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, and a cup of milk. The official claim was that Rome was not executing the Vestal. They were simply placing her in isolation and leaving her fate to the gods. The food and water were meant to prove they weren't committing murder. But this was legal fiction at its most cruel. The provisions were carefully measured to prolong her agony. The lamp had oil for perhaps 6 hours. The food and water might last 2 or 3 days. But the air in the sealed chamber would run out long before the food did. The descent into the chamber was itself a ritual of terror. The Vestal had to walk down the steps on her own. She could not be carried or forced, because that would make Rome directly responsible for her death. She had to participate in her own burial, making the final choice to step into the chamber that would become her tomb. Once she reached the bottom, the staircase was quickly dismantled. Workers filled the opening with earth and stones, packing it so tightly that no sound could escape. The surface was smoothed over and marked only with a small stone that bore no inscription. Within hours, no visible trace remained of what had happened there. Ancient sources describe what followed in clinical detail, which only makes the horror more unbearable. The condemned Vestal would have several hours of lamplight to reflect on her fate. She could see the food and water, could calculate exactly how long her torment might last. She could hear her own breathing grow heavier as the oxygen slowly thinned. Some accounts mention scratching sounds heard from beneath the ground in the days after such burial. Workers reported strange noises coming from the earth near these sites. Sounds that might have been fingernails clawing at stone or wooden planks scraping against dirt as the victim tried desperately to escape. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating part was the silence that always followed. The victim's name was erased from all public records. Her family was forbidden to mourn her or even speak her name. She did not simply die. She was erased, removed from existence, as if she had never been born. This erasure was so complete that modern historians struggle to identify the women who suffered this fate, because their names were systematically deleted from surviving documents. We know the practice happened often, over centuries, but the victims became nameless shadows lost to memory. The legal excuse remained the same throughout Roman history. Because the Vestals stepped into the chamber willingly, because food and water were provided, because no Roman citizen laid a hand on her. This wasn't considered execution. It was called divine judgment, carried out through natural consequences. After 30 years of service, surviving Vestals were in theory free to leave temple life and rejoin Roman society. They were given ceremonies honoring their decades of loyalty, financial rewards from the state treasury, and official permission to marry and start families. It sounds like a happy ending to a difficult life, but the reality was far darker. Consider the simple math of this so-called freedom. A girl chosen at age 8 would be released at 38. In a world where most Roman women married in their teens and began bearing children right away, a 38-year-old was considered far past her childbearing years and largely unmarriageable. The right to marry was meaningless when no one wanted to marry you, and the obstacles weren't only biological, they were social. Romans believed that a woman who had spent 3 decades in sacred service was no longer like other women. She had been touched by divine forces in ways that made her unsuitable for ordinary human relationships. Men feared that marrying a former Vestal would bring divine punishment, or that her decades of enforced celibacy had somehow ruined her ability to be a proper wife. The case of Claudia Quinta shows this cruel reality. After completing her service in 43 CE, she was given a substantial dowry and introduced to several potential husbands from respectable families. But every engagement was broken once the men's families consulted religious authorities, who declared that marrying a former Vestal would corrupt their bloodline and anger the gods. Claudia spent the last 20 years of her life alone in a small house outside Rome, shunned by the very society she had served so faithfully. She never married, never had children, and died in complete isolation. Her funeral was attended by no one except hired mourners, and she was buried in an unmarked grave. Even the financial rewards promised to former Vestals often vanished. Bureaucratic obstacles and legal loopholes meant many women discovered their pensions had been reduced or erased entirely during their decades of service. They emerged from temple life not just socially isolated, but also financially desperate, with no family support system and no practical skills to survive. The psychological damage from 3 decades of institutional trauma made reintegration even harder. Former Vestals often suffered from what modern medicine would call severe post-traumatic stress disorder. They endured panic attacks, paranoid episodes, and constant difficulty forming normal human relationships, after years of emotional suppression and forced isolation. Historical accounts describe women waking in the night, screaming from nightmares about the sacred flame going out, compulsively checking and rechecking the locks on their doors, or recoiling from human touch as if it burned them. Their minds had been so thoroughly conditioned by fear and solitude that freedom itself felt more terrifying than captivity. Some attempted suicide rather than face life beyond the temple wall. Others withdrew into total isolation, recreating their cloistered existence inside private homes where they lived like ghosts of their former selves. A few tried desperately to reintegrate into society, but found themselves completely unprepared for basic social interactions after decades of ritualized behavior. The most tragic cases involved former Vestals who developed what historians called sacred madness. They wandered through Rome claiming to receive visions from Vesta, preaching to crowds about divine revelations, and performing strange rituals in public space. Roman authorities usually ignored these displays, treating the women as harmless lunatics rather than confronting the systematic trauma that had created their condition. Perhaps most cruel of all, some former Vestals were recruited back into temple service as advisors or supervisors, forcing them to pass on the very same cycle of abuse to new generations. Having survived their own torment, they became complicit in inflicting it on others, preserving these brutal practices for centuries. The promise of freedom after 30 years of service was revealed as the cruelest deception of all. These women had given up their youth, their fertility, their families, and their sanity for Rome. In return, they received social exile, economic abandonment, and psychological destruction that lasted until death. The treatment of Vestal Virgins reveals the sophisticated cruelty that Rome disguised as religious devotion. These women were not just victims of individual sadists or corrupt officials. They were casualties of a systematic program designed to control female autonomy through institutionalized terror. Modern psychological analysis of historical accounts suggests that the Vestal system was essentially a centuries-long experiment in trauma-based social control. By taking girls at their most vulnerable age, isolating them from normal human development, and subjecting them to cycles of unpredictable punishment and reward, Rome created a class of women who were entirely dependent on institutional approval for survival. The three punishments we've explored represent escalating levels of dehumanization. Ritual beatings destroyed their sense of physical safety. Living burial eliminated their hope for future freedom. And the false promise of eventual liberation crushed their spirits entirely by showing that even perfect service led only to abandonment and exile. What makes this system particularly horrific is how completely it was normalized within Roman society. Citizens who would have been outraged by similar treatment of male slaves accepted the torture of Vestal Virgins as necessary for maintaining divine favor and social order. Religious justification made the cruelty invisible, both to most contemporaries and to later historians. The legacy of these practices stretches far beyond ancient Rome. The use of sexual purity as a tool of social control, the institutionalization of violence against women under the cover of religion, and the manipulation of victims into accepting their own oppression are patterns repeated throughout history and still visible today. These forgotten women deserve to be remembered, not as symbols of Roman piety, but as human beings who endured unimaginable suffering in service to an empire that valued obedience over humanity. Their stories remind us that the most dangerous tyrannies are those cloaked in sacred authority and divine justification for human cruelty. If you found this exploration of hidden history compelling, subscribe for more content uncovering the disturbing truths behind historical myths, and comment below to share which dark chapters of the past you'd like to see explored. Countless buried stories still wait to be told. Remember, these women lived, suffered, and died as real human beings, not as footnotes to imperial glory. By remembering their stories, we honor not just their courage, but our duty to recognize and resist institutionalized cruelty wherever it appears.